somebody to come and deliver a talk on this topic. So without further ado, I do want to start off, inshallah, as we always do, with the tilawah of the Quran. So I would like to invite my younger brother, inshallah, to come forward and recite some verses from Surah An-Nisa, the Surah of the women.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا وآتوا اليتامى أموالهم ولا تتبدلوا الخبيث بالطيب ولا تأكلوا أموالهم إلى أموالكم إنه كان حوبا كبيرا وإن خفتم ألا تقسطوا في اليتامى فانكحوا ما طاب لكم من النساء مثنى وثلاث ورباع فإن خفتم ألا تعدلوا فواحدة أو ما ملكت أيمانكم ذلك أدنى ألا تعولوا وآتوا النساء صدقاتهن نحلة فإن طبن لكم عن شيء منه نفسا فكلوه هنيئا مريئا ولا تؤتوا السفهاء أموالكم التي جعل الله لكم قياما وارزقوهم فيها واكسوهم وقولوا لهم قولا معروفا.
So Allah Jalla fil Ula says, O men, fear your Lord who created you from a single soul, and from it created its match, and spread many men and women from the two. Fear Allah, in whose name you ask each other for your rights, and fear the violation of the rights of the womb relations. Surely Allah is watchful over you. Give the orphans their property, and do not substitute what is bad for what is good, and do not eat up their property along with your own. It is surely a great sin. If you fear that you will not do justice to the orphans, then marry the women you like, in twos, in threes, and in fours. But if you fear that you will not maintain equity, then keep to one woman, or bondswomen you own. It will be closer to abstaining from injustice. Give women their dower in good cheer. Then if they forego some of it of their own will, you may have it as pleasant and joyful. Do not give the feeble-minded your property that Allah has made a means of support for you, and do feed them from it and clothe them and speak to them in fair words. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. And now, without further ado, inshallah, I'd like to invite Sister Zara Faris. A brief biography, just off the top of my head.
Okay, sure.
She's a graduate of SOAS, Arabic and Islamic Studies, I think. Spent a year in Egypt, doing further studies in Arabic. She has debated and written on the topic of women's rights in Islam across the world, I think. And she's debated prominent feminists like Natalie Bennett for various media publications, including the BBC. She's done things for her as well. And so, inshallah, without further ado.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. First of all, I'd like to say Jazakumullah khair for coming here today. This one and this one? Okay. Especially on a Saturday evening, given the weather outside, it's nice to be able to gather with our Muslim brothers and sisters for something that hopefully will benefit everybody here in some way or other, inshallah. So the topic for today, broadly speaking, is feminism and Islam. And obviously this can be discussed in so many different ways. And in the short space that we have today, obviously we're not going to be able to cover everything that I would love to download. But I'm going to cover a few of the things that I think are important to lay a groundwork in understanding these things. And then hopefully in the future, if you'd like to reach out or visit more of my work, or if you'd like to have another session, then we can always go into things a little bit further then as well, inshallah. Now, first of all, why are we even discussing this? Now, as Muslims, we believe that Islam provides the solutions to all human problems. This is why we are Muslim in the first place. We believe that the Quran and the Hadith and the whole of Islam provides us with the guidance and instruction that we need, not only to live our day-to-day lives, but to resolve obstacles as and when they arise, to resolve small problems and big problems as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us as Muslims to be problem solvers, using these solutions. This is the role of a Muslim. So whether it's through acts of charity, so something small such as removing an obstacle from a road, or even something that is small as smiling at someone, this is considered a solution that you are putting out into the world, something that you are doing to improve the state of society, the state of conditions around you. Or even if it's through necessary acts, so not just through charitable voluntary acts, but through things which we are tasked to do as Muslims. So we are ordered in Islam to find cures for sickness. We are ordered to try to help alleviate the plights of those that are in need of our help. Whether they are Muslim or non-Muslim is irrelevant. So we are given the duty of, and we are rewarded for, solving problems using Islam's solutions. This is something I think we all agree on. I think majority, if not everybody here is Muslim. This is a groundwork that we don't need to really go into any further. So the Quran commands us to be witnesses to mankind, to call to what is just, and to warn against what is wrong. So we're required to be problem solvers and to advise the correct solution, i.e. the Islamic solution. Now, in terms of the types of problems we're facing today, the types of problems that we have to try to resolve, there's a wide panoply of problems that we have. So we have, for example, global poverty, injustice, exploitations of various forms, oppression, violence, neo-slavery, neo-colonialism, pollution, climate change, simultaneous epidemics of starvation and obesity, lack of health care for all, hatred, intolerance. The list is endless. And all of these, in some form or other, involve either the ignorance, the denial, or the exploitation of rights, whether those rights are the rights of creation or whether those rights are the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over us. Now, in a Muslim society, getting down to the topic that we're talking about today, the lack of implementation of women's rights in particular serves as a very stark and obvious piece of evidence that society overall is not functioning correctly on Islamic principles. So the lack of implemented rights for women is actually the symptom of a deeper problem that pervades all other aspects of society. It doesn't exist by itself. It's not just in a vacuum that women's rights are being undermined or not implemented. So how do Muslims go about implementing or repairing these rights? Because these have actually been drastically eroded and hidden away behind a lot of post-colonial culture and a lot of modern ideologies. Now, why do I say that it's been eroded? And the reason is that because this wasn't the case until very recently. This current state of play that we see with the Muslim world, the state of oppression, this wasn't the case until very, very recently. And by very recently, I mean, for example, as late as the 18th century, one English travel writer, she traveled to the Muslim world, in particular Turkey. And she wrote about what she saw of Muslim women in the Muslim world. And remember, we're not talking about 7th century, 8th century, 9th century. We're talking about fairly modern world history, the 18th century. And she said as follows: as to women, as many, if not more than men, are to be seen in the streets, in other words, going about their daily activities. She says, I think I never saw a country where women may enjoy so much liberty and free from all reproach as in Turkey. And the Turks in their conduct towards women are an example to all other nations. And I repeat it, sir, I think no women have so much liberty safe from apprehension as the Turkish. And I think them in their manner of living capable of being the happiest creatures breathing. Which is, knowing what we know about Islam, if we are aware of the rights of Islam and if we are aware of how it looks when it is operated and when it is implemented properly, this is a fairly reasonable depiction or a reasonable opinion. Now, having said that, the situation of Muslim women has always been used throughout recent history as the theme of action or the subject by those that are working to intellectually subdue Muslim communities. So, for example, in colonial Egypt, British colonial officials specifically cited the veil and treatment of women under Islam as their justification for colonialism in the first place. So they would use women as an excuse and say, oh, we need to go in and rescue the women because the women are being oppressed by Islam, just because the women's life was different to what they were used to in their societies. And ironically, many of these colonial officials would actually be suppressing women's rights movements in their home countries, but then using it as an excuse in foreign countries to assert their colonial authority and say, oh, these women need rescuing. And there's one very interesting anti-colonialist philosopher, Frantz Fanon. Some of you may have heard of him. And he talked about some of the colonial projects or administration in Algeria. And he said that the political doctrine that some of these colonizers had was that in order to, and I quote Frantz Fanon's description of this, he said that to destroy the structures of Algerian society, to destroy its capacity for resistance, they must first of all conquer the women. They must go and find them behind the veil where they hide themselves. And this is a very interesting description and quite an accurate description of how the colonialists viewed the importance of undermining the perceived value of women in Muslim societies, to make these women think that you're not valued in your society, because they knew that from the women came the backbone of society. It was the women nurturing the children, the women that were making societies tick over, running households, running businesses, running a great many things. And similarly, more recently in the US, the Bush administration also cited the liberation of women as their key interest in the lead up to the Iraq War. So it's very much a common theme to cite rescuing women as an excuse, or liberating women as an excuse. This doesn't detract from the fact that there is imbalance and oppression in Muslim countries, and we'll get into more of that detail shortly. But it's to show how it's used against the Muslim community at the same time to undermine their intellectual confidence. Now, we're not going to go into a very detailed diagnosis of the Muslim world today, because that's a whole topic in of itself. But we can say by way of summary that the Muslim world is currently exhibiting the traumas resulting from this post-colonial amputation of Islam from its education system. So a lot of the colonial powers, what they did was they enforced the fact that education had to be secular, so people would no longer study Islam as a core part of their curriculum, along with math and science and language, but rather it was separated out. And so people's contact with learning about Sharia, with learning Arabic, with learning fiqh, that was all amputated from the education system. So what this resulted in is a broadly shallow understanding of Islam that was very far removed from the classical, rich, sophisticated understanding of how Islam is to be applied in multitude of scenarios. And this is what's given rise to a domino effect of injustice against both women and men, different classes of people, different races of people. And so what this shallow thinking has done, and this state of being in decay, is that people who are oppressed or who are downtrodden or who are feeling disgraced, what they end up doing is they end up either imitating or becoming more susceptible to those ideas that they feel were successful in oppressing them. So in this case, they would become more susceptible to the ideas and the way of life of their former colonizers. And in particular, many Muslims have become susceptible to the ideology they're exposed to, secular liberalism and its many avatars. And we'll go into some of this today and how this relates to the discussion of feminism. But it's important to have a backdrop for what the state of mind is that we're dealing with in the first place. Now, as a result of what we've just discussed, many of our parents' generation, Muslims of the post-colonial era, they would often argue or hold that their culture, whether it was Arab nationalism, Arab national socialism, communism, or in the Indian subcontinent where there is a lot of Indian or Hindu culture mixed in with the way that people live in Muslim society, or there is a lot of Victorian British ideals mixed in with the way that we perceive ourselves and the way that we operate. Now, many of our parents struggled with these influences. And some of our parents' generation adopted these things as well and enforced them or tried to hold on to them, either arguing that these things were either compatible with Islam, or some would even argue, no, these things are from Islam. Many of us may have experienced this with our parents' generation or heard of stories where you hear some very cultural things being enforced. But this is where it comes from. Now, similarly today, we may think, oh, we're past that. We're not susceptible to that sort of thing. You know, we've seen through the mist. You know, we've seen through the cultural fog, and we can tell what's Islam and what is not. But actually, Muslims today are facing the exact same test as the previous generation. The only difference is it's with different cultures and practices and different ideologies. And we're making the same excuses as our parents' generation were. So, in the absence of a righteous Islamic governance, Muslims are often conflicted between their families' inherited cultures, the current Western culture that we live in or that we are exposed to, and Islam itself as well. And the thing is, often people know the difference. They know what is Islam and what is not, but often they still revert back to the culture that they come from because it's comfortable. People tend to revert to their comfort zone. It's easier than making a change. It's easier than struggling to cut things out of your life or to change things or to change the way you view the world. But regardless of time and space, we all know that Muslims are directed by their Creator in the Holy Quran not to compete with each other based on the cultures that God brought us forth from, but to compete with each other based on righteousness. So this is how we measure our behavior. It's not on our culture. It's not on the foods we eat. It's not on how we practice our weddings. It's not on, those are the benign cultural things, but there are also negative cultural things. It's not about that. That's not what we should be competing on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, "O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female and made you into peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you." And this righteousness also is not left to us to just decide on a whim. What does righteousness look like? How does it feel in your heart? Righteousness is clearly defined for us by Islam, by the Quran, by the Hadith. And this righteousness is what is supposed to obliterate allegiance to anything other than Islam. So there should be no asabiyya, no allegiance that is based on commonalities that happen to exist between you and another person. So we're not supposed to just have allegiance, for example, to someone because they happen to have the same gender as us, or they happen to be from the same country as us, or they happen to be in the same wealth bracket as us, or something ridiculous like that. Allegiance to Islam overrides all of that. Now, feminism too is a cultural influence that is currently relevant. That's why we're talking about it today, because it happens to be significant right now in the West. It wasn't a presence, before, until, very recent history. And that's why we're now talking about it. And we weren't talking about it in the last 1400 years of feminism, of Islam, although we were talking about women's rights. Women's rights is something that we'll go on to see are intrinsic to Islam anyway. But because it's relevant now, sometimes we hear feminism being invoked as a response to some of the problems that we are facing as Muslims. And unfortunately, there is a lot of confusion and misunderstanding that comes about when we imagine, and this is the first thing that we need to grasp when we're looking at this topic, when we mistakenly imagine that feminism is the only way to visualize or actualize women's rights. So when we imagine that feminism is just another word for women's rights, that's where we make the first mistake. When we imagine that feminism is comparable in any way to Islam, that it covers the breadth and extent with certainty and with certain sources, when we make the mistake of saying that they are comparable somehow and that they are equatable somehow, this is when we make the mistake with the subject. And so this conflation is one of the first things that we need to resolve. Now, what's interesting is that whilst this may seem like a really pressing matter, the reality is that in the UK today, polls show that only 7% of women in the UK, so I'm not talking about like only Muslim women or only certain groups, 7% of women overall identify as feminist. And this poll was carried out by the Fawcett Society, which is a feminist, society in the UK. Even though they found that the majorities of men and women reported belief in gender equality. So what does that show us then? The majority of people report a belief in gender equality, yet only 7% of women identify as feminist. This shows that those who do identify as feminist don't hold a monopoly on women's rights or the liberal idea of equality, which we'll get into a little bit later. But they don't hold a monopoly on this, the way that we sometimes seem to imagine that feminism does. Now, even secular liberals today consciously choose not to use the label feminist. They choose not to call themselves feminists, with some reporting that they find the term actually an encumbrance. They find it a hindrance to use the term because they find it actually creates obstacles for them rather than makes things easy. So with so many competing, with so many competing interpretations and factions and divisions that there are of feminism, many find that feminism doesn't actually add any ideological clarity to their cause. They find that it doesn't actually help them explain what it is that they're trying to achieve. In fact, many feminists seem to spend a lot of time attempting to clarify to the public what they think being feminist means in the first place. You hear a lot of people saying, that's not my feminism is this, my feminism is that. So a lot of the energy involved is actually on explaining feminism in the first place. So the meaning of the term itself is confused even further when it's applied anachronistically for political purposes. Now, what I mean by this is, there's an example, there is a woman called Caroline Norton. She was around in the 19th century, and she's famous because in English law, she was the one that pushed for women's rights in child custody, to form contracts, to inherit, and keep possession of, and for women to keep possession of their own earnings. So Caroline Norton is famous for this, and she never identified herself as a feminist. In fact, she even wrote in a petition to the Queen, and it's not just that she didn't call herself a feminist, but she wasn't a feminist even by conventional standards of the term. Like, the simplest meaning of the term is equality, which we'll go into later and why that's not actually accurate. But even by those standards, she once wrote in a petition to the Queen, and remember, this is the woman that pushed through a lot of laws for English, important laws for women in English law. She said, and we don't agree with this, but she said, the natural position of woman is inferiority to man. Amen. I never pretended to the wild and ridiculous doctrine of equality. She wrote this in a letter to the Queen, and yet today, feminists call her the first feminist legislator. So what does the term mean then? It seems to be applied to anybody that happens to be working in a way that involves women's rights. Now, the reality is that those that identify as feminists are just one group amongst many throughout different cultures, throughout different time periods, whose work involves women's rights. So, feminism is just one approach. It doesn't have a monopoly. Another way to conceive this or to perceive this is that feminism is to women's rights what capitalism or communism are to economics. So economics as a subject is about the distribution of resources, and capitalism and communism and even Islam each have their own approach to how resources should be distributed. They each have their own approach to economics. Similarly, feminism is just one approach to the matter of women's rights, and Islam has a different approach to the matter of women's rights. And other religions may have different approaches to the matter of women's rights, etc., etc. So we need to start seeing feminism in a contained way, because it is a contained thing, but because we live in a society where this is the form of feminism around us, this is why sometimes we conflate it with women's rights altogether, and that's something that we need to stop doing so that we can give space for other approaches, such as Islam, to actually explain what women's rights is through Islam. Now, feminists often use the language of secular liberalism by invoking seemingly, laudable concepts such as equality, freedom, and empowerment. These things, who has a problem with these things, right? They sound like great things, and this is why, at a superficial level, it makes it sound like a very attractive movement or a label to get behind. But just as feminism shares the language of liberalism, it also unfortunately shares its contradictions. And an analogy for understanding this is that equality, freedom, and empowerment, and I'll explain how, but equality, freedom, and empowerment, these three things, is like playing rock, paper, scissors. Did anybody used to play that rock, paper, scissors, right? Each one actually limits the next one. Equality, freedom, and power, just like rock, paper, scissors, they cancel each other out. Because if everybody is equal in the eyes of the law, then empowerment, i.e. giving someone an advantage over another, negates that equality. So that's the first cancellation. Equality, similarly, restricts freedom because it imposes uniformity. It says everybody has to be the same, so you can't have freedom to do something different. You have to be, having the same set of freedoms as everybody else. And maintaining individual freedom or, empowerment actually denies the empowerment of somebody else over you. So they all cancel each other out, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on one or two of these shortly. Essentially, we find that they each have an erroneous rationale and they lead to damaging outcomes. So, for example, individualism, which carries with it some essences, some elements of freedom and empowerment, but I'll go into that. Currently, Western culture and civilization and feminism are based on the dogma of individualism. And individualism is antithetical to Islam. It's the opposite. Because it makes the assumptions that humans are merely individuals with no purpose except to exist as individuals, maximizing your own autonomy, your own power, your own freedom, your own abilities to do as you please in society and in life. The reality, however, is that humans, like cells in the body, aren't merely individuals. We're social creatures. We are defined to some extent by society, by culture, by parents, by our genetics, by the languages we're taught, which, by the way, no human being can learn to speak if you existed as an individual. You can only learn to speak language through social interaction with others. And very interesting studies have found that if you don't have social interaction with others at the important formative years of your life, which is when you're young and you're learning language, for example, they found cases of feral children where children were left in the wild or had no interaction. They never learned the speaking skills. They never learned the motor skills to actually speak, even if they were taught later in life. This is how dependent we are on one another and how non-individualist we actually are in reality. And this is why solitary confinement, for example, is considered to be, one of the most inhumane and harshest punishments, because we are instinctively social creatures. We have many instinctive needs that can only be fulfilled by other people. We were created in the universe, along with the limitations of the universe, along with our nature and genetics. We were not responsible for creating the universe, so we are not outside of it as individuals. We are in it with its characteristics. Now, mostly we are passive recipients of a lot of these realities. We don't get to choose where we're born and all of those things, or how we're born, or what we look like, or what our natural, physicality is. There's no escape from some of these things. However, individualism's claim to put the individual above these realities, to say we are outside of this, we are almost as disembodied heads, we are just minds floating around, self-actualizing, and we don't have the need for some of these things. This is what it often calls liberation, to free ourselves from society's realities, but actually ends up being its biggest delusion, and it disconnects humans from their higher purpose, and it leaves people vulnerable to the oppression of whoever happens to be most powerful in society. So when feminism calls on and utilizes individualism, it is having the same impact. Now, one example to explain this is the idea or the question of who owns your human body. Now, some people may discuss this in their law classes, but I'm talking about on a rational level. Who owns your human body? And one of the key messages that is commonly conveyed to women, either directly or covertly, is that your body is yours, and you can dress it or undress it the way that you like, regardless of the circumstances. Now, this used to only be touted by fashion designers in the good old days, so to speak, but it is now employed and increasingly employed by, Islamophobic politicians that like to insist you are oppressed if you cover your body, but also by many feminists upholding one of the underlying fundamentals of liberal feminism, and therefore theories of how women have the right to dress, which is the idea of ownership over one's body. But how do we answer this question of who owns your body? Now, for secular liberal feminists, the idea that a woman should practice modesty, or the idea that society can influence or be a consideration in how much of your body you decide to reveal or hide, they say that this implies that your body doesn't belong to you, and that you need to reclaim that by doing whatever you like with it. And so there's a term that they use, and I promised that I wouldn't get academic, but this is not academic. I'm going to explain the term, and then you're going to know what it means. So the term that they use, and they've written many essays about this in various feminist journals, is enmeshment or embodiment. And they say that they define this as, they argue that women, unlike men, are perceived as being bodies instead of being perceived as rational beings that happen to have bodies. So they say that men are perceived as rational that happen to have bodies, but women are perceived as just being bodies. There's no rationale there. Women are not perceived as having a conscience or agency. So they call this embodiment, and they say that modesty is one of the, the signs that you are suffering from this enmeshment. Now, how exactly do any of us, men or women, own our own bodies? Because if ownership is control, then neither men nor women own their bodies. We didn't give birth to ourselves. We didn't make ourselves. We didn't decide our natural shape and size. If ownership is maintenance, then we can't actually survive without depending on other bodies looking after us when we're older. We can't survive without trading with other people. So clearly, we don't own our bodies in that sense either. We're not independent of our environment and the need for social interaction for our continued existence and mental well-being. And so Islam recognizes that we, neither men nor women, own our own bodies. And so we don't have the complete right to decide what we do with them. In fact, we are entrusted with them. Our bodies are considered an amana from the Creator, and the body actually has rights over us, and we have rights and duties towards each other with them. Now, the reality is that Islam liberates us from enslavement to causality by making us submit to the ultimate cause. So, whilst feminism makes the female individual the arbiter in working out what is good for women. Islam, on the other hand, makes God the arbiter. This is one of the fundamental differences that cannot be escaped no matter which type of feminism you look at. In Islam, the difference is that God is the arbiter. And God makes the male or female the agent of his will, not the decider of his will. So in other words, whilst feminism is self-centric, Islam is God-centric. Now, what about equality? Now, advocates of equality generally claim that bringing about equality in society will increase the availability of resources for people, increase the availability of opportunities for people, particularly to those that were previously discriminated or deprived members of society. So in other words, they claim that increased equality will increase individual autonomy and therefore perhaps the quality of life. Now, whilst the term equality may intuitively resonate with many people, again on a superficial level, the term itself, what's to complain about, we actually find on closer inspection the following problems. And this is not what I'm saying, this is actually what many of its own advocates, its own philosophers have said as well. So people like Joel Feinberg, Isaiah Berlin, Will Kimlicka, they've said that they've admitted that it has no rational basis. And the reason for this is because no two people, regardless of their gender, no two people in the entire universe are identical in either their physicalities, their capabilities, or their tendencies. So how then can equalizing their resources lead to just treatment of them? It's an absurdity and it doesn't make sense. Now, the second problem with it is that it actually leads to absurd consequences in practice. So, for example, men are typically known at the moment to have a shorter life expectancy than women. So women tend to live longer than men do. Now, if you were to apply equality in this sense, equality of resources and opportunities, then what would this mean? This would mean that in the shorter life that men have, we should apportion them more resources and more opportunities to make up for the shortfall that will occur after they die and women continue receiving resources and opportunities. So it results in special treatment in this case. So this is what equality, this is the absurd outcome that this equality brings about. It doesn't make any sense. So this strict adherence to equal material resources, this is what it manifests as. And it has manifested as similar things, not this particular hypothetical, but in other scenarios. Another problem is that it gives rise to moral inequality in practice. So, for example, when you try to level the playing field, between this huge category of men and women, this ignores many differences that exist within those groups. So it ignores the fact that some women are of upper class and some men are of lower class. Some of these people are in minority groups, some of these people are more advantaged, some of these people are more disadvantaged. It ignores all of those variables and simply treats these two groups as very homogeneous, and it ignores the differences the important differences that exist. Another problem is that it can't be applied without contradicting itself. So, for example, the claim is that, everybody is equal, and yet most governments would be considered to be betraying their own citizens if they treated foreigners as equal to their own citizens. So if they gave foreigners the same rights as their own citizens, they would be treated as betraying their own citizens. But aren't all people equal? So here we see that it's not actually applied without contradicting itself in the real world. Another example is all children are equal, they are, and yet parents are not expected to have the same level of responsibility towards other children as they have towards their own. So again, in practice, it can't be applied without contradicting itself. Now, most importantly, and finally, on this point of equality, is that it is actually a misdiagnosis. So the hypothesis behind it is that it's saying that inequality of material resources is the reason for injustice in society in the first place. And in fact, even some feminists realize the absurdity of this when they realize that in meritocratic environments, So in societies where, there was, minimal or what perceived, gender disparities, they found that even in meritocratic environments, women still preferred to work less hours than men, and they still preferred to leave their careers to pursue family life more than men did, even in, all things being equal to the extent humanly possible. So for these reasons, it would be very misguided of us to pursue this liberal conception of equality if we really want to resolve injustice in society, because we see that actually on a whole lot of levels, it is merely a nice sounding platitude that doesn't really work out. Now, to summarize the differences, like feminism can be said to advocate, freedom for instinctive needs, whereas Islam advocates the organization of instinctive needs. So it doesn't try to shut them out or close them out, but Islam encourages these to be organized. I'll go into a little bit about that very shortly. Whilst feminism advocates equality, Islam advocates balance. It advocates consistency and balance. And whilst feminism advocates the empowerment of the individual, Islam advocates the empowerment of Islam through the duties of the individual. Now, Islam has provided rights for women in a very profound and insightful formulation that brings about this balance that we're talking about. Now, for Muslims, it was God, not humans, not feminists, not self-centric men or women, but God that decided that a woman's deeds would be judged no differently than a man's deeds in terms of good conduct, truthfulness, patience, charity, fasting, repentance, their bidding of what is good and forbidding of what is bad, her use of knowledge. It was God, not humans, that stated in the Quran, "I do not waste the deed of any doer among you, be they male or female. The one of you is as the other." It was God, not humans, that decided that there will be no difference between a man's worship and a woman's worship. And in Islam, a woman is an independent entity like a man and a fully accountable human being for her decisions and actions. And her acceptance of Islam is out of her own original and independent will. It's not by proxy through her father or her brother or any other male relative. And similarly, all of her obligations are her own. You can't, outsource your obligations to anybody. And it was God, not humans, that decided that she would have her own legal standing and that she could aspire towards professions or vocations, and if she raised children, then heaven would be under her feet. This was God, not humans, not feminists, not anybody trying to calculate, the greatest happiness for the greatest number or anything like that. It was God, not humans, that decided that a woman had the right to be provided for and that nobody could control her wealth, and that if she were to provide for her family, she would actually get more reward than her husband if she did that. And she would have rights, and that she, in any case, would have rights over her husband, just as he has rights over her. It was God, not humans, not feminists, but God, that ordained that she should have the right to respect, which you will not find in, some of these rights that I'm going to read now. You won't find them enshrined in any legal system. But God ordained that a wife would have the right to respect, the wife would have the right to affection, the wife would have the right to time from her husband, the right to shelter provided by her husband, the right to food and clothing equal in quality to her husbands. Although I always like to point out that a lot of women dress a lot better than their husbands, so maybe you don't want equality with your husband in that regard. But they also have the right to physical protection provided by her husband, the right to a dowry. These are not things that we have to formulate or think up. These are not things we have to say to other Muslims, these are our, these should be our rights. These are things we can say are our rights, but we need them implemented. We need them repaired. We need them restored. We don't have to argue over the fact that they exist in the first place because they were ordained by our Creator. And this is why when we approach challenges in this regard, when we are trying to question oppressions that exist, if we go from a different framework, such as feminism, it's less likely to have an impact on the person you are trying to appeal to. If you are trying to appeal to Muslims, the best rubric to use is Islam, because they will not, it's harder shy away from the fact that it is God's order that you are defying. You're not, it's not what feminism says, it's not what feminists say. These are things that God says, and it's very clear for us. Now, men and women don't have equal inheritance in Islam because we do not have equal economic obligations to provide. Obviously, there are always exceptional circumstances, but the general rule is, as I have said. And despite and because of this, women have often played a fundamental role in the voluntary distribution of their personal wealth. So because nobody has a claim over women's wealth and she can do with it what she wants, during the 18th century, for example, under the Ottoman Caliphate, Ottoman women of all classes, not just the upper classes, but of all classes, established 20 to 30% of all the charitable foundations or trusts in society. So in Arabic, they're called waqf or awqaf. So schools, hospitals, caravansaries, baths, fountains, soup kitchens, hostels, and mosques, they were all financed throughout the lands by women from their own personal resources for the benefit of the public. And this was because they have the mercies that Islam has given, which is they don't have to provide, and their wealth is not to be, controlled by anyone other than her. But Muslims are given a duty to do good wherever they can, and so women tended to use their wealth in this way for the betterment of society overall. It was God, not humans, that decided that a woman would be obliged, just as a man was, to seek knowledge, to seek education, to advocate what is good and forbid what is wrong. And it was God that ordained that vast portions of Islam would be transmitted to Muslims by women, including Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, because of this, women have fulfilled the intellectual work of, a lot of the intellectual work of Muslims. So, for example, the contemporary Sheikh Akram Nadwi has documented at least 8,000 Muslim female scholars across global history in the field of hadith sciences alone. So this is not including other sciences like medical sciences and other things which women were also, active in, but only in the science, the field of hadith sciences, at least 8,000 known muhaddithat. And consider, if any of you do, attend circles or, are in contact with, female alimas, you'll know that a lot of female scholars and female teachers don't even want to be known. They don't want to be in a public persona or on the public scene. They like their privacy. They want to confine their teaching or their impact to their immediate community around them. And so imagine how many there would have been that are not counted for in this study. Now, because Islam doesn't make a differentiation between, or a discriminatory differentiation between the male and female intellects, both male and female students are reported throughout history to have congregated to learn from these female intellects. And there's even cases where they would be crowding around a female scholar's home, hanging on the walls and waiting for their turn just to, learn something from her. And there are very notable male scholars that are reported to have taken knowledge from female scholars. And I'm sure you will recognize these names, but such scholars include Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Dhahabi, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Imam Abu Hanifa, and even the Caliph Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. So these are some of the giants of our, Islamic corpus, and they were known to have studied and taken knowledge from female scholars. In the past cities of Central Asia, it's reported that a legal opinion or fatwa would only be issued from a house if it had also the signatures of not only the householder but his daughter, his wife, or his sister. Now, some of you may already be aware of some of these things, but it's also always helpful to have a reminder of the impact that it has on society when things are in balance. And one final reminder on that point is, not only have female scholars played an undeniable role in the history of Islamic, or the development of Islamic law, but Islamic courts in our history were so renowned for guaranteeing justice for women that during the Ottoman Caliphate, when different religious groups had access to their own religious authority, so under the Ottoman Caliphate, the Jewish community had access to their own Jewish courts, the Christian community had access to their own Christian courts, different society had access to their own legal authorities. Even though they had that access, women of other religious communities preferred to have their matters dealt with by the Muslim Qadi in the Islamic courts because they felt that they were more just to their women's needs. Now, whilst God provided rights for women, some of us may know all of the rights, some of us may know some of them, some people may have heard some of these things here and been like, oh, I didn't know that one, or I didn't know that one. Now, whilst God provided rights for women, the rights of any person in Islam are incumbent upon another person fulfilling a duty. So my right to live involves other people's duty not to, take me out. So anytime you have a right, it involves someone else's duty. And more pertinent examples are the following. So, for example, for a Muslim woman to manage her own economic affairs, such as some of the examples I've mentioned, and to be provided for, depends on the duty that a male relative has to provide for her. But this becomes a pipe dream in situations of poverty. If there's poverty and work, is, men are struggling to find work, or, if you look sometimes around the streets, if you visit, I see it in Pakistan, sometimes very small boys, like they look like they're around 4 or 5 years old. You think they're going to school, they're not, they're going to work. To earn money for their families back home, including their sisters, In that scenario, the Muslim woman still has a right to be provided for. The male relative, adult relative, not the child, but the male relative has the duty to provide for her. But we must think, if there is a situation of poverty, how can you demand your rights without ensuring that the other person has the ability, or there is the infrastructure there for the other person to fulfill their duty to enable that to happen? And this is why asking for rights in a vacuum without considering these infrastructural realities is kind of a waste of time. It is always worth highlighting the fact that certain injustices are being carried out, but it is naive of us to think that merely focusing on the right is going to change or fulfill those rights. Another example, the right to obtain legal remedies. For example, in the event of a divorce or marital discord, this depends on the duty of those that are in authority to manage people's affairs with justice. It depends on, those that are in authority, the Islamic courts, to actually, manage people's affairs justly. But again, this becomes almost impossible if there is the lack of... Is everybody okay? Okay, just chairs. Okay, so the right to obtain legal remedies in the event of a divorce or marital discord, this depends on the duty of those in authority to manage people's affairs justly. But again, this becomes impossible if there is the lack of an Islamic authority, or if there is a lack of suitable courts to hear these complaints. So the right exists, the right is still there, but there is no infrastructure or capability to fulfill that right. And so our attention will need to focus not only on, just the fact that the right is not being fulfilled, but what is missing and what can we do to fill that gap, not only for our own benefit, but for the functioning of society overall. Similarly, the right to go out and seek knowledge depends on the duty of those that have knowledge to actually convey what they've learned. But again, this becomes hazardous or impossible if the streets are filled with violence or war, or there is no safety in the streets, or if people are too busy scraping together a living to even think about enhancing themselves through knowledge. If they're thinking about how to get food on the table for their kids at the end of the day, then the idea of going out to seek knowledge, whilst it is, a duty of everybody to seek in whatever capacity they can, becomes very difficult. And it's for this reason that most men tend to choose work not based on what they enjoy, or based on what inspires them, or based on what they would really love to do, but what actually might make the most money so that they can provide for their families, or even just to get by. And it's often against the grain of corruption and tyranny. So, prior to the Arab Spring and perhaps even continuing, there was a heavy problem of unemployment in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia. And many of the men that kind of triggered some of the Arab Spring, they were basically men that were they're really struggling, wanting to provide for their families. They didn't want, to say, oh, I want to become, an archaeologist and, society isn't letting me. They actually just wanted to be able to earn money in a legal and, and a halal way to provide for their families. Now, there is an interconnectedness in Islam between one person's rights, regardless of gender, and the duties of an entire community. There is an interconnectedness between the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the teachers and the students. And whenever God has given someone an advantage in society, he's made them all the more accountable and given them all the more responsibility for what they do with that advantage. And those with disadvantage, and everybody is advantaged and disadvantaged in different aspects of their life, but in any aspects in which a person is disadvantaged, you have rights over others. So instead of merely demanding rights, which is what most social justice movements or whatever kind of movements, most identity politic movements are focused on, we should be seeking ways to ensure that each part of society is able to fulfill its duties. And this is how we restore the balance or the mizan, how we balance the scale once again, so that these injustices, these symptoms are no longer occurring. And again, it's not only the rights of women that are being oppressed. As I mentioned, the simple right to be able to work, many men's rights are also being, in the Muslim world, there is a domino effect of oppression in with different people in society. We're just looking at this as one symptom amongst many. Now, you may hear some people call themselves intersectional feminists. So they would say, well, I'm not, that kind of feminist. I don't only focus on gender. I realize that oppression to women occurs when there are economical, social, and political factors as well. Well, all this is an admission that feminism itself is inadequate to deal with some of these problems, and we need a framework that actually is able to analyze the wider problem, is able to analyze the social problems, the economic problems, the political problems as well. And this is what Islam is. The interconnectedness of Islam, if you want to call it, it results in an intersectional approach, means that we don't need any other rubric with which to analyze and diagnose and fix the problems of society, because Islam already takes a holistic approach to providing remedies for these injustices. This is why we see how interconnected things are, and how when one thing is out of balance, it results in an oppression elsewhere. Now, there's a very interesting parable that I like to share that demonstrates this difference between, or this importance of rights and duties, as opposed to equality, or as opposed to individualism, as opposed to every man for himself, or every woman for herself. Now, this parable isn't from an Islamic text, but I'm going to share one from Islamic text just after. But this one is very interesting, and it's very depictive. Now, there's a wise man's tale, and it says that heaven and hell are identical. And it says that people are sat around a table facing each other, just the same in both. Now, let me tell it properly. There's a man, and he dies, and he goes up to the skies. And there he meets an angel. And the angel says to him, okay, it's time for me to, take you to either heaven or hell. And the man, he says, before you take me to either, I'd like to see both. I'd like to see both before I go to wherever I'm ending up. So the angel says, okay, come on, I'll show you. So the angel takes him to these, double doors. And he says, this is hell. And he opens the doors, and, the man is expecting, certain thing. He's expecting fire and brimstone, and the man looks inside, and what he sees surprises him. He sees that there are, it's a long, it's a very, very long, beautiful dining hall. And in this dining hall are lots of tables running up and down. It's full of these, very beautiful, laid out tables. And these tables you know, like in Harry Potter, or if you've ever been to Cambridge for a meal or something, in Harry Potter, these long tables are decked out with food, and similarly, this is what the man sees. He sees, you know, crispy cuisine, you know, hot, steaming, every kind of food that you could possibly imagine from all over the world, things he hasn't even seen in his real life. And he's like, wait, this is hell? And the angel says, yes. And so the man looks more closely, and he sees that on either side of the table, people are sitting in front of this food, but they all look really miserable. And he looks and he sees that they have these really long chopsticks. And they're all really struggling with these super long chopsticks to pick up food and then reach around and fit it into their mouths, because the chopsticks are just too long. And so they're all suffering, basically, in front of all these beautiful delicacies. They can't enjoy any of it. And so the man, you know, is deeply troubled by this, and he's like, you know, this is really a horrible sight to behold. And he says to the angel, okay, I'd like to see heaven now. So the angel takes him to another room. He opens his identical pair of doors. The man looks inside, and he sees an identical room, exactly the same tables, piled high, fresh with food, drink, cuisine. And he sees people on either side of the tables, laughing, joking, having a good time, talking. And he's like, okay, this makes more sense. And he looks closer and he sees that they also have these really long chopsticks. Now, he looks and he says, how comes they're having a good time and the people in hell are having a bad time? And he sees that in hell, everybody was trying to feed themselves, but in heaven, everybody's picking up the food with their chopsticks, reaching over the table and feeding each other. And so in that way, everybody's needs are being fulfilled, because we're not depending only on ourselves to fulfill our own needs, but we realize that there is a reciprocity between people. There is a need and a dependence on one another. And this is one of the key differences between Islam and many other campaigns for justice, such as, you know, feminism or secular liberal feminism. Now, another parable, and this is from the Hadith, similarly portrays this in a very beautiful way. Now, I'm not going to quote all of it. I'm going to paraphrase parts of it to make it easier for me to explain. But the Prophet ﷺ said that the example of the person abiding by Allah's order and restrictions in comparison to those who violate them is like the example of those people who drew lots for their seats in a boat. Some of them got seats in the upper part and others in the lower. So it's saying that in life, you know, sometimes people get advantages and so they end up on the upper deck in society. And in some aspects of their life, they are in the lower deck of society. It's not talking about one gender or the other. It's talking about different, or we can understand it to be talking about different characteristics or different aspects of your life. Now, when those in the bottom part needed water, so when those who had a need needed water, they had to go up to bring water. They had to go up and ask those on the upper deck, or ask them on the upper deck to bring them water. And they felt that that troubled them. Those in the lower deck, they didn't want to trouble the people on the upper deck. And so they said, let's make a hole in our part of the ship and get water ourselves, and then we won't have to bother them. Now, if the people in the upper deck let those on the lower deck drill holes into the bottom of the boat, then all of the people of the ship would have been destroyed. But if they prevented them, then all parties would be safe. Now, what this means is that the solution for the lack of rights of people on the lower deck, whether they are people of less wealth, less strength, less power, or less anything, is not that everyone should get a drill for their part of the boat. It's not that everybody should go to emergency measures and start resorting to other ideologies in response. But rather, the solution depends on demanding from the people on the top deck of the boat to fulfill their duty. And it relies on the people on the upper deck of being conscious of that and not allowing things to get to that stage either. And that's where our understanding really needs to focus. That it is not an individualistic struggle just to resolve our own rights, but actually this is a holistic picture. And the reason our rights are important is because they help us all to fulfill our purpose, which is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, unlike feminism, Islam doesn't stop at justice for just one gender, but rather tries to seek holistic justice for all. So when we're asked if we should, for example, ally with feminists, we should ask why some Muslims think that calling yourself a Muslim feminist is more expedient. How is that more useful? How does that help us more than if we just called ourselves Muslim, which is a greater da'wah and a greater testament to our love and need for Islam and nothing else. Now, Islam doesn't promise a utopia, of course, nobody is saying that. But as one of my colleagues put it, my colleague Abdullah Al-Andalusi coined this term, and it's very apt. Instead of a utopia, Islam promises an optopia. In other words, a state of optimal equilibrium, a state of balance. And in order to re-establish that balance, Muslim men and women need to, as Muslims, be confident in pursuing the fact that Islam alone provides a holistic package for the rights of all members of society. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different ways to discuss feminism, but I felt that today, given that we have a shorter amount of time, it would be good to discuss some of the roots of feminism as they come from Western ideology, which we have done today, and to discuss and really get to grips and really cement the fact that feminism and women's rights are not synonymous. Feminism is just one approach, and Islam has its own unique approach that is actually more holistic and more far-reaching than feminism. And it doesn't require on human beings to come up or theorize or experiment with what rights should be and how rights should be coordinated, but actually comes from the Creator himself and are perfectly balanced. And we all know what those rights are. We all know that they exist, but we need to actually implement them. And in order to implement them, we have to understand the wider picture and the wider circumstances that we need to establish in society in order to do that. Jazakumullah khair for listening. I think it's your turn for questions now. Does anybody have any questions to get us started? Yes.
My question was, do you think it's problematic? So you used the term women's rights, and is there, when you say the Islamic concept of women's rights, is there an actual linguistic term that exists? And if not, do you think it's problematic to adopt modes of discourse that has meanings that could conflate with feminism and confuse people? Like, people adopt the term equality, and in the modern context, people take it to mean something else. It's like discourse is a very important play in how you shape people's ideologies. So do you think is that not a massive problem in how we take things into account, like the world around us, the language we use?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is why a lot of the terms we do, correct me if I've misunderstood your question, but a lot of the terms we discussed just now, for example, equality, and how it sounds like a nice, catchy and benign buzzword, but actually when you look at it closely, is deeply problematic and results in, some absurd outcomes, which is what we looked at. And similarly with the term feminism, it carries with it a lot of baggage. And it comes with a lot of, contradictions of its own. Some of them we also looked at. So the language is one of the key things that makes a big impact, not just in what those things mean, but also in how we seek change. So as I mentioned, if we're trying to, for example, reach a Muslim audience, then it is far more impactful and far more effective to use the language of Islam, to use the rights that Islam sets out, and not to use or borrow terms from, for example, this woke culture, if you know what I mean, where these terms kind of mean something very different. They don't necessarily apply, but actually they end up alienating the people that we are trying to get on side. Whereas if you just use Islam as your framework, it is hard for the person, if they are Muslim, to deny what you are saying, providing what you are saying is actually correct and from Islam. And so language is a big part of it. And, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, taught Adam alayhi salam the names of things in order to discern them from other things. And this is why it is so important that we understand the power of language, and why conflating feminism with women's rights is one of the key things that I like to ward against. And this is why one of the projects or the books that I'm writing is Women's Rights Without Feminism, to take back the idea that women's rights is just a category. It's like saying maths or economics, you know, it's just a category. And historically, even in English law, when, you know, you had the suffragettes and the suffragists and, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft, many of them, when they were, and especially Mary Wollstonecraft, never mentioned the word feminist, never mentioned the word feminism. But at that time, what they were seeking was legal equality, legal recognition, legal equality. And it was known as women's rights. And, you know, legal recognition for legal rights isn't something you can, you know, really quibble with, because it's, you know, it's solid, it's law. But as time has gone on, the battle for, you know, claiming ground for feminism or secular feminists has changed. So it went from claiming liberal equality to claiming social equality, and now to claiming other types of equality. And some would argue, and if you go to some of my other lectures that go into this in more depth, actually to seeking advantage rather than equality in order to attempt to level the playing field. But as we looked at with equality earlier, that doesn't really work. It ends up again in absurdities. So, you know, language has a huge impact, and this is why this is something that we need to be aware of. We can talk about women's rights using the term women's rights. You can talk about oppression and injustice. And related to this is the problem of when people immediately diagnose a situation of injustice as being misogyny or patriarchy or toxic masculinity. Now, unless you are a psychologist or a criminologist or, you know, a professional in a field, you don't have the skills to diagnose something as being any of those things. The most we can say as Muslims is that this is an injustice based on our Islamic rights. And that's a far more palatable way to get things across. And it doesn't need to be palatable, but actually that was the wrong word. I don't mean palatable, but what I mean is it's far more accurate to say that something is unjust. And actually you're taking somebody to account more effectively that way than by, you know, misapplied accusations where you can't actually be sure of what the motivation is. All you can say is it's an injustice, so we need to resolve it. So the language that we borrow has a huge impact in how we resolve some of these things.
A lot of the time, especially with the rise of sort of progressive feminism, we're seeing a massive backlash, especially within the far right. Incel culture, a lot of the shootings that have taken place in America are people who are sort of allied to movements that are the voluntary celibate movement and stuff. And a lot of the time we're seeing Muslim men sort of because they see, and to an extent, rightfully so as well, they see the rise of women to be a threat, because then they lose employment, women into the labour force, men can no longer find work, and things like this. And so now you have men, Muslim men, who are trying to reaffirm their masculinity, and in doing so, co-opting a lot of the right-wing misogynist rhetoric. How can men take a stance in reaffirming their masculinity and how can women help them in that sense, Muslim women, without then falling into that sort of rhetoric where it does become woman-hating, which is something that's becoming a lot more, especially on social media.
Social media is a horrible place, to be honest. Social media is like the worst depiction of humanity that you could possibly find, particularly on the subject of gender. You see the worst of all views on social media. Even though I'm a public speaker, I don't really log into my social media unless I really have to, because it's actually not very depictive of people's views in real life to that extent. So, of course, there are always people that really live the way that they come across. But for the most part, people who write or come across a certain way, on the internet would never have the guts to be that way in real life. But that's besides the point. The point is that because we have bought into this Hunger Games of gender, we've bought into this gender war ourselves, we've made the mistake of doing that. This is what is resulting in now two extremes. So on one hand, you have some Muslim sisters who are going towards radical forms of feminism or even, secular feminism itself, or using the term feminism erroneously. Simultaneously, just as you have in Western liberal society, you have the rise of, in Western liberal society, you have the rise of groups such as, it's abbreviated MGTOW, M-G-T-O-W, but it means men going their own way. And basically, this is not amongst Muslims yet, as far as I'm aware, maybe a little bit, but as a response to feminism, many men are saying, you know what, we don't want anything to do with women. We don't want to get married because when we get divorced, she's going to take us for everything we've got. We don't want any kind of responsibility towards women because society has allowed us to be this way. We can have, no strings relationships because we don't need to because women are so independent now. And it has gone to two wacky extremes. And if we are not careful, we will follow in that trend. Now, the problem is that balance is gone that I was talking about. And I think either way, when we adopt the language, whether that is as, I hate using these terms, but, what is called like a white knight or something like that, or whether it's going, Muslim feminist to the, there are two extremes that we can avoid, basically. They should have nothing to do with us. We need to mind our own business and not do what other communities have done. And Islam is meant to be different. And it's supposed to provide us with the equipment to not fall foul or susceptible to those things. So, for example, the Christian community, because it was secularized, some time ago, this means that people are, more able to be susceptible to these other ideas. But Islam has been very hard for society to lobotomize in that way. Islam has been very hard for secular society to kind of separate. It's very hard for people to say to Muslims, Islam is only for your private life, because for us, Islam is life. There is no separation of that. And so for us, we should be more resilient. And where we're not, we need to, call ourselves to task on that. The reality is we need to, be aware of these things. To not fall into that, I mean, we should know better, really. That's the simple answer. We should all, as Muslims, we should know better because we have better guidance. And if we don't, then we need to increase our, our engagement on these issues in a respectful way. But neither side, I think, should be, and I've seen it from both sides, very hostile and very abusive from both sides. It's not just from one to the other. It's not just men to women or just women to men, but it is on both sides. And we need to stop doing that. No matter who we are, we can critique heavily and criticize heavily the ideas without making it personal. And this is the acceptable form of discussion and dialogue in Islam. We should have free rein to ask questions and to criticize the ideas, not the people. But on both sides, we see very hostile language, and it's pushing people further apart. So we need to basically grow up a little bit and remind ourselves that we are Muslim and we have been given something far more honorable than to behave in this way. And just to labor this point a little bit, unfortunately, many of the characteristics that we are taught as children not to do, not to have tantrums, not to be rude, not to misbehave, these are unfortunately the tools now of social justice, warriors. These are the tools of social change now. To be rude, to be insolent, to be a rebel. All those things that we are taught as children not to do are now social currency. And if you don't do them, you're losing out on the argument, because it's no longer a matter of objective truth. It's just a matter of who can make this side look better than the other side. And this is not the way for Muslims to behave at all. So where this is happening, we need to make sure that we don't, fall foul of it on either side. We need to just kind of, behave as Muslims should behave. We do have, yes.
What would you say is, so presumably who doesn't know about feminism and currently relate to the academic aspects of it, how would you say it affects them, and how can they be aware of feminist ideals in them adopting those feminist ideals without them being aware of them?
Okay. Now this is a good question because for anybody that didn't hear, a sister has asked, how can people kind of be aware or beware of feminist ideals if they're not fully versed in what, feminism is all about, or how can they avoid some of the more covert things that feminism might be trying to change amongst Muslim women if you're not fully aware of it. Now, it's a good question because not long ago, an issue came up about women's access to mosques. And in the UK, the majority of mosques have access, some sort of access for women. In the US, all mosques have access, or documented to have access for women. The quality and the other aspects of it are a different story, but all mosques in the US had access, and in the UK, the majority did. A minority don't. It shouldn't be the case, but a minority don't. And as a result, there were, suddenly all these news articles, and I think there was even a documentary decrying the fact that pioneered and pushed forward by Muslim or just feminists, secular liberal feminists, that why do Muslim women not have access to their places of worship? Now, for somebody who is not well versed in feminism, they would say, well, this is good, they're standing up for us, and they're trying to help us out, they're trying to help us out with something that is that we need, we need access to mosques, and we need access to go to the masjid, and these people are helping us, so we should stand by them and we should ally with them. And the reality is that whilst we seemed to have been talking about the same things at that time, we were not asking for the same things, we were actually just meeting at a crossroads. Because the feminist brigade or call in that regard is not about, women having access to the masjid so that they can fulfill, their duties or so that they can worship their creator. For them, it was purely about equality. Ironically, they didn't demand equality that women should be obligated to pray the Friday prayers or other equalities or anything else. It was only on access to the masjid. But the reality is, for us, when we seek things, it has a different purpose. It's for the sake of our Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For feminists, when they seek things, it's for the sake of a female-focused agenda or for equality. And the way to be aware of this is to always question and to be skeptical about why anybody, especially a group or a movement that has historically actually undermined the lives or the abilities of Muslim women. So you have, for example, some feminists that would encourage women to dress, down or to dress less. You have others that would say you should dress like boys. You would have others that would say other conflicting things. So there's no cohesive message amongst them. So sometimes it is hard to tell. But the best framework, you don't have to be aware of feminism. You only have to be aware of Islam. What does Islam say why we are doing things? What does Islam say about what our rights should be? I don't think anyone in this day and age has a lack of resources to find out about these things. But with the issue of the masjid, for example, it ends up being a trap. And people then end up falling into it and thinking feminism is an ally. But when you go deeper into it, you find out that all these different forms of feminism, particularly Muslim feminism or Islamic feminism, one of the self-admitted goals that they have is to reconcile Islam with secular liberal values. It's not to achieve Muslim women's rights through Islam, but to actually reconcile it with Muslim women's values, with secular liberal values. And this is Muslim feminists themselves saying this. So the greatest inoculation, sister, is for women to have a greater knowledge of Islam, but also to go and study other worldviews, to study competing worldviews and see what they say, see how they argue it. And this, in turn, will strengthen our understanding of Islam. It will strengthen our conviction in why Islam is a better solution. And there are no shortage of courses and materials available to do this. So it is our obligation to seek knowledge on this matter, particularly if we see our younger sisters or daughters or nieces may be susceptible to this. Rather than saying, you don't need to know about feminism, say, let's attend a course on, political science in the West and political philosophies in the West, and there are many that are ongoing at the moment. So the answer is to seek knowledge on these things and to arm ourselves. In the Quran, we are told stories of other civilizations and where they went wrong. Why are we told about that? It's so that we don't make the same mistakes. So the answer is that we need to not only increase our understanding of Islam, but also other competing worldviews. Any other questions on the sisters' side? Any on the... Yes?
You mentioned earlier on about, I think it was a meritocratic environment. What is that?
So, meritocratic environment, so some countries will seek to the extent possible, equalize the way that, for example, jobs are meted out. So they will have a quota for boardrooms. So it's called meritocratic, but sometimes it involves a quota, ironically, where you have 50% of a boardroom should be women. But also meritocratic would mean that, for example, a CV would be judged blindly, so you wouldn't know whether it was male or female. And in some countries, they've implemented what they perceive to be a meritocratic environment. So they say that the chance for women to be discriminated is minimized to the extent possible. And in those countries, they found that even where everything was equal, all things being equal, discrimination being minimized or zeroed out if possible, they found that women still preferred at some point to do less hours of work than men, and women still preferred to prioritize family life than men did. And ironically, countries that have harder circumstances, so where things are worse off economically, they actually found that the gender difference between men and women was less. So in countries, for example, Afghanistan or something like that, the characteristics that would typically define women and the characteristics that would typically define men, they were less exaggerated. Whereas if you go to a place where things are more economically prosperous, they found that women had more what would typically be associated as more feminine characteristics, and men were more masculine. So they found this paradox, and this is something that often a lot of people talk about, that why are some movements trying to equalize things in order to equalize the difference between genders, when actually equalizing it results in a greater disparity. So it's one of the ways that we can see that these solutions are very experimental and they don't actually result in justice, but actually Islam's method of balance is what results in, a balanced society overall. Any more questions on this side? No? If you'd like to come and ask a question afterwards, please feel free to do so. And yes?
What advice would you, what takeaway advice would you give to a young lady now, where they're growing up in a society where men aren't men anymore, and chivalry is now nearly dead?
It's a very bleak look on society. I don't know what kind of men are around you, but it's certainly not the case. But just just humouring your point. I'm just joking.
So they're having to almost compete. They're forced to compete, and then that competition between siblings, maybe marriage, whatever it may be, it's almost now becoming almost. So I was asking a group of young ladies who may be here today, inshallah, about what is feminism, and I've never really explored it. And they said it's wage equality and I want to get a job and all the rest of it. So it's a real confusion about, they don't really understand what feminism necessarily is, neither do I. But in that competition, are they losing themselves? So what advice would you maybe give to the young ladies to take away that allows them to be strong and independent without losing their femininity?
Well, I think femininity itself is really just it is kind of almost a subjective thing in terms of how women come across. Femininity in of itself, it doesn't really have an impact on on what you choose to do. Now, some people say that if you become a career woman, some people may say, oh, you become less feminine or something like that because you are competing in a man's world, so to speak, and this means that you take on male characteristics or whatever. in reality, when we are out in public life, it's not really, or it shouldn't be for us, about male or female characteristics, but rather professionalism. So when we are out in public life, we should adopt a professional persona, not a male or a female, or we shouldn't have that in mind where I need to act like a man because I'm going down the street, or I need to act like a man because I'm going to talk to a man at work or something. But rather, we need to adopt an approach of professionalism. What is professional conduct outside of the home? And that shouldn't vary for either men or women. And I mean, that really is it. And I can't, stress that more, because we shouldn't stop ourselves from doing things because, we think it might change our femininity or anything like that, because, it doesn't. What is femininity? I think that's a different discussion. It really is taking a professional attitude, and that's the difference between what a Muslim society would aspire to, which is when you go out. The reason we have the hijab is to minimize the nature of our interactions being of an intimate nature. It's to minimize that intimacy, that personal intimacy that you might have with somebody else. It's actually to say, I'm out here in a public capacity, which means a professional capacity, and we don't need to talk about anything other than what I'm, here to talk about or here to do. And it should be the same for brothers as well. Sometimes we come across brothers that, might be very shy or come across a certain way to Muslim women, but then with non-Muslim women, they're very open or very, flamboyant and maybe even, flirtatious, and it doesn't make any sense. As Muslims, we should have professional conduct at all times, regardless of who we are interacting with in a public environment. But as for, the death of chivalry, again, there are always people in all times and places where, some men may be, more chivalrous or may come across as better than other men. Now, in this time period where, as we touched on earlier, because women are saying they want to do more of the work for themselves, they want to work for themselves, they want to provide for themselves, they don't have the need for a man. Men are also saying, okay, well, we can have relationships and things with women, no strings attached, no responsibilities, no obligations. And so that sense of ghira, that sense of responsibility, that sense of pride or honor in being able to take care financially for women is reduced drastically. But again, as Muslims, we should know better. And we shouldn't be falling into those traps. And again, a lot of this is about, again, becoming closer to Islam and to the model of the Prophet ﷺ, and how he lived his life, and to question, whether this is the way that the Prophet ﷺ would behave. I don't know if that helps to answer your question a little bit. Yes.
In answer to that question, men and women should both demonstrate qualities of femininity and masculinity depending on the situation that you're in. Women do not need to be feminine in certain situations.
So yeah, so exactly. So like in public life, there is no need for the emphasis on either the masculine or the feminine. It's merely like a professional persona that we have, in public life. Okay.
The sisters will have a private session with you now.
Yeah. Shall we do? Okay. Sure.
So just we should close up, inshallah, and then I just wanted to say a closing remark. You mentioned Shabat al-Nadwi and the idea of the muhaddithat. The Karima Foundation, by name, was actually named after one of the great muhaddithat, Karima who, was from Central Asia, a great Hanafi jurist who lived 100 years and taught the Sahih of Imam Bukhari to her death in Makkah al-Mukarramah, where she's buried now. And so I want to say Jazakallah for that, for you coming and for delivering your program. And I hope everybody took a lot of benefit.
Inshallah.
So just